Title is Crumbs from the Table, the Creation of Wealth and the Persistence of Poverty. My name is Miroslav Wolf, and I'm the director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, which is organizing this conference along with, of course, our mother institution, Yale Divinity School and Yale University. Now, when I was thinking about what I should say at the very beginning, I thought maybe of saying, starting it with why conference on this topic, but then I thought everybody who's heard the title knows exactly why conference on this topic is needed. But let me state what may be obvious. There are many fault lines in our beautiful but endangered world. Political, cultural, religious, economic, ecological, and you can continue. And we feel rumblings of various tectonic plates moving, and we are deeply concerned. Arguably, the most significant fault line in the world today is between those who are seemingly feasting with abandon and those who are condemned to fast, not for a day, but for a lifetime. Fast not for religious or health reasons, but out of utter need. Just one statistic: 6 million children under 5 die each year because of hunger. The poor are often held captive by forces beyond themselves, by ecological disasters, by greed for power of the corrupt leaders, by belief systems that render them passive, by bloody ethnic conflict. Bountiful earth is a stingy stepmother to them, and what they get from those who are feasting are mere crumbs from the table. Never in the history of humanity have more people lived in abject poverty than in the past decade. Never in the history of humanity has more wealth been produced than in the past decade. Immense wealth is created, but abject poverty persists. Why? Clearly, there's a problem with distribution of wealth. There is enough wealth to go around, arguably, but those who have are unwilling to give, or unwilling to give in sufficient quantities, and most of what they give is stolen by unscrupulous middle persons. But even if distribution functioned well, gifts that the wealthy give to the poor, whether they give them through the state or privately, would leave in the mouths of those who receive them a bitter taste of humiliation. They are mere receivers. Somebody else is a giver. The problem of poverty is not just the problem of distribution. It is a problem of creation of wealth, not because there's not enough around, but because there's this great prophetic vision of each person sitting under his or her own fig tree, and that prophetic vision strikes us as deeply human. It is a vision of all feasting at the table, none reaching for the crumbs under the table or plaintively stretching their arms to receive leftovers as on our poster. Instead, all participate with dignity in the great circle of giving and of receiving. That is the vision by which we, the organizers of the conference, have been guided. We are appalled by the persistence of poverty. We dream of all people participating in the great project of creation of wealth that serves human needs. The purpose of this conference is to nudge us all to think more intelligently about the problem of poverty and to act more decisively and consistently to overcome it. Before I give the word to the Dean of Yale Divinity School, Harry Attridge, to welcome you all, let me introduce you to some of my team here at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture who have worked very hard to put this conference together. I think in the first place I ought to mention Chris Sharon, director of the center's program Faith as a Way of Life, who is the primary driving force behind the organization of everything that's happening here. So Chris, for those who haven't seen Chris, please stand up. And then, of course, he has been working in cooperation and guided by David Miller, Executive Director of the Center and Director of the program called Ethics and Spirituality in the Workplace. David? Now, I mentioned these folks not only so that you would give them a little applause and know whom to thank, but also in case you have any questions, organizational questions, traffic flow questions, and questions of this sort, these are the folks along with myself to whom you should address these questions. I don't think any of other of our staff is here. I don't think I see them, otherwise I would gladly recognize their presence. I should also mention, before our dean comes, I should mention presence of two board members of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and one of them is the founding member of it, and this is George Bauer. We're delighted, George, that you're here. And then, of course, there's a whole Smith family in the honor of whose spouse and whose mother this conference has been the series of lectures and conferences have been named. Roger, and I don't know whether Scott is here. Now I give word to our dean.
Thank you, Miroslav, and I'll keep my remarks very brief. You don't come to a conference like this to hear administrators talk, right? What I do want to do, however, is to issue a welcome to you all on behalf of Yale Divinity School, a constituent part of Yale. In fact, we like to think of ourselves as what Yale was when it was founded in 1701, eventually became a distinct part of Yale in 1822. And it had something of a rebirth at the beginning of the 21st century, after a time when we were worried a lot about where we should be, what we should be, and the like. One of the elements of that rebirth was a bit of a vision that George and Sarah and other members of our advisory board had, a vision that said we ought to be engaged in a very significant way in dealing with the problems of this world as we know it, and the ways in which religion can intersect with those problems. And they suggested we ought to have something called a Center for Faith and Culture. And people like George and his colleagues on the board enabled us to do so, and Sarah, through her benefaction, made this kind of conference possible. So this is something that we have embraced and something that we are absolutely delighted has taken off in the way that it has, because it's an important part of what we always have been here at Yale Divinity School, to provide leadership both for church and civil society. That is Yale's mission, and it's our mission. And in order to do that, we have to embrace and engage in the problems that this world confronts. So the Center for Faith and Culture helps us to do that, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to be part of a conversation about a very significant issue that we're all facing. So enjoy this next 24 hours, and I look forward to getting to meet many of you during this time. Thank you. Let me introduce the Secretary of the University and Vice President of the University, Linda Lorimer, with whom I serve on a number of committees and who is an absolute delight to work with. So, Linda.
Thank you. In listening to Miroslav's introduction, where he talks about the mothers, if the Divinity School is the mother, I must be the grandmother for this enterprise, and is delighted to be here on behalf of the university to offer welcome to all of you at this very important conference. I had the privilege of meeting Sarah Smith, what was it, about 10 years ago, and we had time together over a number of sessions in a number of years, in which we talked about her faith, we talked about her family, and we talked about her time here, which really mattered to her. As Harry has alluded, she was a member of the Board of Advisors, which was extremely important to her, and she was one of those who gave me great tips about what was really going on up here at the Hill, at a time before the current administration, I would say. I had heard even much more about Sarah early and often because my husband, Charlie Ellis, was one of her greatest admirers. He is so sorry to be out of town tonight, He has rank on me since he's a Yale trustee, and he really would have bumped me off the program to offer the greetings, both because of his longtime affection for the family generally, and because Roger, who was here tonight, was his partner as well as long-term friend. By all reports, and certainly by my every observation, Sarah was a rare individual, a combination of intelligence and courage, humor and faith. I think that George would attest to that in terms of the association on the board. Also, I will say, in the book that she published, in ways that in many ways resonate with this conferences, she wrote courageously and convincingly about some of the most difficult situations one might confront, only for one purpose, to help others, despite the pain of what it must have entailed. I think that that is a kind of moral leadership, to be sure. So I offer my warmest greetings to the family. I think it says a lot about this place, this Divinity School, as well as the students who come here, to think that so soon after her graduation, when she had the opportunity, that she put forth her own resources to create this kind of conversation, which will be important not only in the life of the Divinity School, but because, as we've heard, what it means for the world in which we hope to inhabit and to provide as stewards for the 21st century. Thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Linda. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce my very good friend, our distinguished speaker for this evening, Dr. Vinay Samuel. I first met Vinay, may I? Dr. Samuel, at one of the conferences organized in preparation for what became then historic statement on economic issues entitled the Oxford Declaration on Christian Faith and Economics. And it was he, along with other of his colleagues, who has nudged me, then aspiring budding scholar without PhD, eager to learn, to think about issues of poverty not simply as an issue of distribution, but to think about issues of poverty as the issue of creation of wealth. And he knew what he was talking. He was not only a student of economics, but also has grappled with the problem of poverty, not just with his pen in his hand, but also with sleeves rolled up in many impoverished suburbs of Bangalore, India. In 1977, he founded a program to equip development workers for the Evangelical Fellowship of India Commission on Relief, and this organization has worked for some 27 years to populate many parts of India as well as other parts of Asia with people who are deeply immersed in development work. And his own interest in such issues has led him also to found Oxford Center for Mission Studies, which is a training center for mission practitioners from the global south. Now, last time that I met Vinay, I reminded him of that, was just about before war broke out in former Yugoslavia. We were in Osijek, in Evangelical Theological Seminary. It was a meeting of Third World Theologians, which he was also at one point chairing. Only months after that conference, Yugoslavia was plunged into war. Now, I trust that our meeting today in my new home, if it contributes to any kind of war subsequently or is associated with it, that this would be war on poverty, a war which can be won, a war which would have no losers. Please welcome with me Vinay Samuel.
Thank you. It is my privilege to be at Yale, and I'm deeply grateful to Miroslav, a good friend, and Chris Sharon for inviting me to actually begin this dialogue and discussion, consideration, with a presentation on the theme. I am an Anglican priest, and for me, when you talk about the table, I come from a fairly Catholic Anglican tradition. The table is really a table for everybody, and a table which is always with the richest of food available for everyone. There are no crumbs on it at all. So in a sense, it's a stark contrast between the table, which is the heart of Christian worship. And the tables which are laid out in the world where, unfortunately, people have to look out for crumbs and just hope to get them. I think that is the kind of imagery that comes to me as I begin to reflect on it. And what I want to do is to share with you, as not only as someone who is a Christian priest, but an activist in seeking for the last 40 years to address poverty, share my own journey and the Christian themes, and that's really my brief this evening, to share the Christian themes rather than go into economics and business, which I leave it to others who are far better qualified, and my younger colleague, Colleen Timms, who is a businessman who can make money, and I can't honestly, but to share much more the practical side of that. But for me, I trust you'll bear with me as I carry on. I'm sorry, I had a PowerPoint presentation because I know that everyone who's worth his salt as a speaker these days has to have a exceedingly brilliant and wonderful PowerPoint presentation. And I can't do PowerPoints. I asked my daughter to do some fairly nice, all these things that jump out of the screen and make you, mine is so prosaic, so dumb, I feel I shouldn't really do that. But, and yet I come from Bangalore, which is the capital of all these things. We create all these things. So I feel, I am kind of an internet immigrant. I'm not a native, as I'm told. But I'm glad, I hope you don't mind, just looking at my face, and I hope I can be a preacher, typical Anglican preacher. I hope you don't mind my sharing with you. The statement, "the poor will always be with you," highlights the biblical recognition of the persistence of poverty in the midst of plenty. This recognition does not lead to resignation, but calls to do justice to the poor. The persistence of poverty in the midst of the rapid growth of the city of Bangalore in South India is one of the contexts that shaped my reflection this evening. The city of Bangalore enjoys enormous growth in wealth among parts of its population. And yet, there is such abject poverty, which continues to persist. And that's what I live with part of the time. I'm now resident for the last 16 years, part of the time in Oxford in England, and I'm aware of the growing wealth of Western Europe. I see the gap between wealthy nations and poor countries accelerate and fear that it will never close. Even the few bridges we have built between the two may become more symbolic than empowering. In such a context, what keeps me from losing hope and energy for transformative engagement is the moral vision of the Bible, Christian tradition of mission, and the humanity and spirituality of the poor, whose lives and witness both challenge and encourage me. In this presentation, I seek to share the biblical themes that have shaped my own, and theological themes that have shaped my own engagement in finding enterprise solutions to poverty, which has been a theme for the last 30 years in my own life. What are enterprise solutions? Not kind of political solutions, but enterprise solutions to poverty. 6 weeks ago, I visited a rural area 300 miles north of Bangalore city in South India. 30 years ago, when I last saw it, it was one of the poorest areas of South India. It has changed with World Bank loans for infrastructural development, for roads, irrigation, and power. It was strange to see the lush paddy fields and international schools with state-of-the-art swimming pools and riding ranges for students from wealthy families. Amid signs of wealth, landless laborers continue to live in poverty. Their villages had electric power, but their homes did not. Their wages did not keep pace with inflation. I spent a significant time with groups of poor men and women and did not see the bitterness of inequality dominate their lives. But I was aware of a sense of generosity as a natural center of their humanity. There was no class anger, despite the fact that there was a strong presence of Marxist-Leninist cadres and militia in the area. In South India, with kills policemen, kills government officers, all that. I doubt if social pedagogy to instill and inculcate class anger, which some development organizations seek to do among the poor. You can only transform yourself by actually getting angry with your situation. And only when you have that kind of an anger, culture of anger, deeply ingrained in you, then you'll better your lives. You're able to change it. Now, that was what I was fed on as a young man of the 60s, okay? Fed on that kind of a social vision. Get them to get angry about the situation and change it. What I saw really, as I've seen for years, is the springs of generosity have not dried up because of their poverty. They were there. So how can you build transformative action, not on the anger of the poor, but on the generosity that they seem to have? That's intriguing, isn't it? Very intriguing. The poor people I met demonstrated that their personhood, created in God's unique image, was not totally distorted or deformed by the enormous challenges of poverty they faced. It was nurtured by their spirituality, their personhood, a simple recognition of the reality of God and a daily connection with God in worship and prayer. And this is kind of an Anglican diocese that I was visiting. And it was an old sort of SPG, Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, Anglican diocese, which is still completely Anglican. It did not even become part of the United Church of South India for 30 years later because they wanted to be simply Anglican. And therefore, they worship every day. And I was amazed, I had to get up, unusually, of course, unlike in England, 6 in the morning, get on to morning prayer in 3 different places, get on to a Eucharist in 2 different places, goes on day after day after day, and of course 3 breakfasts, and so on and so forth. So, but it's a part of the generosity, part of understanding that you connect with God every day, and therefore that produces generosity. And you have to build on that, rather than instill through some kind of a social engineering or pedagogy or social action, a kind of class anger. For over 30 years, the biblical teaching of creation has shaped my engagement in addressing poverty. One key access point to the biblical understanding of creation for me and to many of my colleagues is human personhood. It has become the focal point of addressing economic poverty through enterprise solutions, persons. The biblical teaching of creation, recovered in Hebrew biblical scholarship in the early 70s, highlighted the stewardly role of humans as those made in God's image, and so regents and representatives of the Creator King. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, humans are given responsibility for the care of creation, with the gifts of creativity to grow, multiply, and exploit its resources for the common good. Human beings were under God's providential care for the whole of creation. The garden in which the first pair was placed recognizes God's provision for human flourishing, with freedom to be fruitful and with responsibility to care. Such provision leads to thanksgiving to God in worship, and this generosity of thanksgiving flows out of a generosity in all relationships. The generosity of the poor I have worked with for over 35 years retains that key attribute of human personhood, fundamental generosity. What does the distortion, spoiling, and violence that the fall and sin bring into creation and to human personhood then mean? What does that mean? Needless to say, the poor experience violence. They experience inhumanity, distortion of relationships, dysfunctional families, spoiling of the environment daily. The effects of the fall and sin are visible and palpable. But the recognition that God is present among them, and I'm here speaking of the religious poor, and most poor I know are the religious poor, prevents the abandonment of hope, personal responsibility, community, and neighborliness. What Walter Brueggemann, in his comments on Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 12 to 14, draws out the central problem of wealth as forgetting God. When you're satiated, says Deuteronomy, you will forget God. When you're filled, you will forget God. That's what God said to those people. His people. God becomes at best distant and often invisible and forgotten, which is why, says Brueggemann, God calls his satiated people, if we may say so, the wealth that we in the last 10 years created more than any other time in history, to worship, where they can remember him and their own history with their God. That's what they're called. Not into all kinds of tremendous action out of guilt or anything, but simply to come back to worship this God. I think that's my starting point. Obviously, you'll expect that from an Anglican. But the poor rarely, if ever, forget God. Their poverty will not let them forget God. And so their poverty keeps their hope and generosity alive and continues to retain those key attributes of their personhood as God's creatures. I'm encouraged that some seriously wealthy people today see the poor and do not forget them. And that's incredible. See, when you forget God and God is no longer visible to you, you also forget the poor, and the poor are no longer visible to you. A lot of wealthy people actually don't see the poor. They know poor exists somewhere, but they don't actually see them. And that is why I'm so encouraged today. In the last 5 years, I've seen so many really very, very wealthy people, especially from the United States and elsewhere, who are saying, now we do see them. We don't want to forget them. And I think that is a new generation. That's why I'm delighted to come here and share. Because that is a challenge. You're not forgetting the poor. And that's the beginning. To see and experience the lives of the poor is not too far away from seeing and experiencing the God of the poor. Possibly, to really experience God in this postmodern world, with all its cynicism, with all its uncertainty, it's possibly one gateway, and maybe the best gateway to experience the real God, the most powerful God, maybe through beginning to see the God of the poor and relating to them in some way or the other. I'm encouraged that many of the wealthy are keen to address poverty and turn to faith-based initiatives that serve the poor. The biblical teaching of creation is a rich resource that shapes Christian engagement in addressing poverty. The biblical view of creativity, work, and rest from work all provide the context of the Christian struggle for the rights of the poor. They also show that such Christian engagement is not just to produce a legal framework, a public policy, and laws to ensure the rights of the poor, but to ensure that our rights activism, which is dominant in our world today, especially for those who are socially active, it's all rights-based, rights-focused. Such activism actually empowers the personhood of the poor, not just provides some frameworks and some policies and just leaves the poor and their personhood. That's what they need. If it does not empower the personhood of the poor, it becomes the achievement of the activist with little impact on the livelihood situation of the poor. It is this that has led some of us to give significance to actions that empower the personhood of the poor. In our experience, one of the most fruitful actions is economic empowerment through access to financial capital, through training in business skills, and through mechanisms that support the poor in the challenges of achieving sustainable livelihoods. At the center of human personhood is human dignity that comes from a creation perspective and is rooted in human relationship to God as his children. It is easy to affirm that all humans are God's children, and Mahatma Gandhi said so. To all the poor, he said, you're God's children, and particularly the poor. But the Christian gospel offers to all, and particularly the poor, the right to enter into such a filial relationship with God, affirms such a status, and this is what is unique about the Christian approach, is that it gives content to it. One of the biggest problems with just calling a lot of poor, untouchable people in India, you're God's children, was that very term, Harijan, which is God's children, became a statement of insult, really. It's an insulting statement of denigration, is the word I was looking for. A statement of denigration. Because there was no content given to it. Just giving a label does not empower the poor. The Christian gospel offers to all this gift. The Christian engagement in empowering the poor to find economic solutions to poverty gives substance to their dignity as God's children. In my own work with the poor, I've traveled from affirming the dignity of the poor to recognizing the dignity they possessed, the dignity that flows from their experience of God's presence and generosity. When a poor man cries, God answers. We talk about listening these days. In our Anglican world, we are all trying to listen to each other, and we're doing our best to listen. But, the whole idea of how do you understand from the Bible what is speaking and listening? God speaks. Who listens? What is a biblical theology of listening? I still have to find a book which writes on a biblical. Maybe Miroslav should write that. A theology of listening. How do you listen to people? In the Bible it says God listens to the poor. No question. There is. And in some ways, listening to the poor, we will hear the voice of God also, much more clearly in our own lives. These are some very key areas. Such experiences are the basis of generosity that marks their life. Far from bringing the gift of dignity to the poor, I find myself a recipient of their generosity, affirming my dignity as God's child. See, for many years, in the 70s, I used to talk about, like many others, I would talk about the culture of the poor. The poor have a culture that keeps them poor. The poor have a culture of, consumption of resources. They don't know how to use capital. They hardly have ever had capital anyway. They don't know how to save. They don't save. They live for the day. All sorts of books were written in the 70s. And it still goes on, culture of the poor. It's quite true that poverty does play a role in shaping the culture of the poor and dominating their lives. But I'm beginning to see that fundamentally, alongside that, there is a culture of generosity that the poor really have, that needs to be built up, that needs to be accessed in order to deal with all those cultures that dominate their life and keep them poor. More later of that. Secondly, another biblical theme that shaped our engagement in transformational mission is the theme of the covenant, particularly the Jubilee regulations. Obviously, these are all things that have been said before, but I thought it's important to repeat them. God's covenant with creation is stressed to Noah after the near destruction of humanity. This highlighted the vulnerability of human life on earth and God's promise that is the basis of human hope and security. It is God's covenant with his people. It is in God's covenant with his people that we have the framework of the relationship God sets out between himself and humanity. It is a framework of mutual obligations, regulations, and security. Biblical scholarship has identified the unique features of the Sinai covenant in contrast to the contemporary Hittite and other covenants in the ancient Near East. Contemporary covenants of that time focused on non-interference between parties with agreed boundaries and security for each group. A covenant becomes something like a contract. The Sinai covenant focused on mutuality with justice for and protection of the weak as a major theme. So the Jubilee regulations are the economic covenant designed by God and protected and served by his covenant. The Jubilee regulations provided for sustenance of families through gleaning rules, release from debt that would break up families and send its members into bonded labor with wealthy families and the provision of capital for a new start. I see this, it's one of the most tragic things to see in the poor communities that I worked with in India, is when the family gets broken up because the mother has to go work somewhere else, the children are sent off into bonded labor somewhere else, and the family gets broken up. And one of the things my wife and I have always done for 35 years is longing to see father, mother, children reunited. Imagine that was what was envisaged with the Jubilee regulation, when children would probably be sold off into slavery to work for somewhere else. They had to go and work somewhere because their land was taken away. They could no longer work on their land. They had no capital. They were split apart. And after 50 years, to go back and to be a family again on land. Imagine that. On television, when I was last month and I was in India on television, this whole situation was going on of a particular village where they were sending all their children to work as laborers. Children under the age of 12 to work as laborers. And since, wonderful activists had all brought the children back, the families were fighting and saying, look, these children produce the money for us. We'd rather be without the family than starve. But God's vision is you should have the family and live. That's really the focus of all this. It's a very simple image. My Father's house is a theme in Jesus' teaching that echoes the Jubilee vision and provides a larger context in which God's promises are fulfilled. At the heart of Jubilee regulations is the affirmation of the equality of every human person and every family. and the right of family to be together. In Paul's teaching, we note the appeal to generosity as the basic motivation for giving that moves towards equality. What Paul does in his Corinthian teaching is to say, your generosity and equality. Equality doesn't come through mere regulation, mere law. Equality is only possible when there is real outflow of generosity. It is to be rooted in generosity, in giving. In many ways, I think American culture understands that, with the focus on giving and stewardship. That is very unique to American culture. And I think I'm delighted with that. But to be able to draw on it and build on it, that's truly Christian. The Jubilee regulations provide God's pattern for ensuring family sustainability and continually seeking equality. Not merely family sustainability, but also to seek equality. The operation of God's grace in gifting humans with generosity is not only the basis for debt forgiveness, but access to capital for a new start for poor families, communities, and nations. The covenant relationship with God is founded in mutuality. For Christians, the covenant becomes the ruling framework for all relationships. Mutuality is the organizing principle for all relationships. From a Christian perspective, the rapidly increasing gulf between the wealth-creating and wealth-owning world and the world of the poor is a challenge to the biblical vision of covenantal obligation to God with people, and so people with people. It is the wholeness of the family, economic activity at the service of the family. That's what Jubilee is all about. Jubilee regulations can only work when we recognize our covenantal obligations of mutuality. They work best when they are driven by human generosity and not legal obligation. Mutuality and generosity reinforce each other among the wealthy and the poor. I also have close connections with the Anglican Church in Kenya, which I've been a part of for a number of years. And because of that, those connections, I used to meet with senior officials and those who became quite wealthy, Kenyans who became quite wealthy. And I would always appeal to not their responsibility constantly for, taking care of the poor in the Matari Valley, which is a terrible big slum. But I would talk about the fact that, the generosity of God must show out in their generosity, in the way generosity results in the policies and their actions. And what I would find was that they who received so much somehow were not generous. That was very strange, very difficult to cope with. Third theme, reconciliation. A central theme of Paul's teaching is God reconciling the world to himself in Christ, and the ministry of reconciliation to which the church and every Christian is called. Reconciliation becomes a key resource in shaping our engagement in enterprise solutions to poverty. Poverty brings alienation, breakdown, and disconnections in many areas of personal and social life. Poverty disconnects persons and families from means of livelihood. It's a disconnect, it's a sense of alienation that the poor. That's one of the aspects of the life of the poor, is the sense of being disconnected from everything that can enrich your life, everything that can enable you to care for your own family. It's this sense of disconnect. And what is reconciliation if it's not connecting what sin and human greed has disconnected? That's a beautiful theme. Struggles for resources are, poverty disconnects persons and families from means of life. Struggles for resources perceived as very limited introduces suspicion and selfishness among families and communities. In addressing the area of alienation from resources of sustainable livelihood, we have found the understanding of reconciliation as a powerfully empowering theme. As this key area of alienation gets addressed through access to resources, opportunity to address livelihood needs, other areas of family dysfunction and breakdown also begin to get addressed. This is one of the wonderful things about working with poor people, is to see how children get connected to schools, a family gets connected to education and livelihood earning, and then the alienations that have made them dysfunctional and broken down begin to get addressed. And you see the wholeness emerging over and over again. I can name you families. In my mind's eye, I can see a number of these families whose lives have been transformed. At the heart of reconciliation is forgiveness and healing that restores relationships to their intended states and makes possible God's purpose for all relationships in his creation. The experience of reconciliation, however small, however material, has the potential for leading human communities to recognize God's action for reconciliation in Christ, which includes the whole of creation subjected to the fall. You know, I was trying to teach environmental care to poor people. And one of the best ways to talk about them was the connection, the healing that God brings in our relationships. All that gets disconnected. When humans are disconnected to material resources and the connection and alienated from it, we misuse them. And it's that a simple person begins to understand and begins to see how that what Jesus did on the cross, which the Bible describes as reconciling us to God, is really a powerful theme in helping us to understand very many different aspects of the disconnect, the breakdown that we see in human societies. And this is also the whole area of peacemaking in religiously. I'll come back to that later. Poverty also erodes trust in communities and reinforces suspicion. Trust is critical to economic success, however small and simple the economic activity. The teaching of reconciliation addresses this trust deficit in our communities. Some of the things that we do with microenterprise, I'll come back to the microenterprise thing, which Colin will describe more in detail. But, small loans that we give to the poor and the way in which we help people. But you see, they come together in groups where they support each other. They save together for a number of years, number of months. It is as they begin to save and use their savings. Now, a group of 20 people start saving together. They save probably 50 cents a week. Then to be able to take your savings, give it to one of the members of your group in order that they can use it, requires a bit of trust, doesn't it? That's why we call trust banks. And yet, trust is a difficult thing. When no one has trusted you, you have to take care of yourself all your life. You're suspicious of everybody exploiting you. And that's one of the most significant things that microenterprise has done, is to begin to build trust, which is the foundational values of enterprise development and of economics development, of wealth creation. Fourthly, the neighbor. The teaching of Jesus about the neighbor is another significant theme that shapes our response to poverty. In Deuteronomy, God's people were enjoined to love God and to love one's neighbor. The neighbor was not just a tribal member. Even the alien in their midst became their neighbor. In Jesus' teaching, this gets applied to those in need, particularly the poor, the story of the Samaritan, you remember. And in a world where neighborhoods of the same subclass are created, gated, and maintained, it is necessary for Christians to recover and live out the biblical mandate of becoming a neighbor. I never thought I'd see it in Bangalore, but we are beginning to see gated communities in Bangalore of the extremely wealthy, where a flat will cost you, about $3 or $5 million or more these days. And entirely 3,000 flats for the super rich to be able to live in totally gated communities, so that when they fly off to Silicon Valley, they don't see any difference between the community there and their pad in Silicon Valley. In that kind of a world, it is necessary for Christians to recover and live out the biblical mandate of being a neighbor. Biblical teaching privileges our neighborly relations to the poor and assesses our love for God by that criteria, as the letter of James so forcefully asserts. I don't even read the letter of James to wealthy Americans because it sounds so Marxist. But it is there. It's very tough. Very, very tough. The so-called self-help groups, which we use, they're called SHGs, self-help groups. These are small groups where people come to help each other, are at the heart of the microenterprise developmental programs all over the world. In one sense, the groups are wrongly named. They're actually neighborhood groups of mutual support, solidarity, and self-help. They're not self-help. They're not, I'm not joined a group to help myself. That we leave to certain wealthy people. Okay? Or that I leave to, as a member of the Rotary Club, that I leave to the Rotarians. Sorry to say, if any of you are Rotarians, I'm just teasing you, but I hope you understand. It's fundamentally a neighborhood group. It's a neighborhood group. The group member is your neighbor. Your welfare and your success in your micro-enterprise depends on her success. The funds are mutual, and success is only possible as mutual success. The entire operation is shaped by a commitment to neighborliness. It is possible that such an understanding prevents growth and scaling up. That's one of the problems with microenterprise. It prevents. You've got to be sufficiently selfish to be able to grow and scale up and become wealthy. So how do you balance the two? This is really one of the struggles we face in microenterprise. And I know what Colin will say, but I'll let him justify a biblical vision of selfishness for you tomorrow. It is here. We have a challenge before us. The biblical teaching of the neighbor stresses our connectedness to other persons and particularly to the poor. It stresses our commitment to the common good while not displacing our freedom to create, scale up, and flourish. Biblical teaching stresses that the calling to neighborliness is directed to the haves, in particular to those who have. The onus is upon them to be a neighbor. Read the Good Samaritan story. Who is a neighbor? They should take the initiative to be neighbors to those who are struggling to be human. One of the key outcomes of empowering individuals and families through microfinance is the empowering of their identity and personhood as those able to be stewards of resources, able to exercise freedoms and choices. One of the most wonderful things that I see is when we do microenterprises, as the income of the family just keeps growing, not marginally, significantly. Usually we discover it goes about 45% a year, but they start so small, it's not a significant amount, but it keeps growing. When it does, what happens is the ability of the family to make decisions for their children, to take them to a school, and pay. Imagine the joy of a father to be able to say, I can now, or a mother to say, I can now pay. I can now choose the school where my child can go. Look at the freedom. The idea of freedom, deeply. Freedom is to choose, not for yourself. That is postmodern stuff for certain societies. But, it is primarily for your family, for your children. That's where my Indianness comes in. I guess we are so family orientated. Okay? But you understand, that is really what it's about. And that is the heart of this very important thing. As microfinance moves, it is the gift of the community. Well, identity is a gift of the community and is the service of the common good and is accountable to the common good. As microfinance moves on to small and medium business development with the poor, will it still be able to be shaped by that sense of neighborliness? This is a challenge to all of us who are involved in microfinance, some of us for more than 35 years. Christian engagement must ensure that the focus on public goods and the common good that the teaching of the neighbor privileges continues to shape enterprise approaches to poverty reduction. And then the Holy Spirit. Another key biblical theme that has shaped our engagement in economic development is the work of the Holy Spirit. Here, of course, I salute Miroslav, who's done some most significant work on the Spirit and work and Spirit and economics. And that has been a great resource to us. And that's why I'm delighted that he is here. The Spirit's many-sided work is not only directed at convincing and convicting the world of sin, but also in endowing human persons with gifts to do the work of God's creation. The work of the Spirit confirms one's calling and vocation in the world and empowers in fulfilling that vocation. The diversity of gifts of the Spirit and the common purpose of the gifts becomes a foundational theme in equipping the poor to find God's purpose in their economic activity, experience God's gift from their work, and fulfill God's purposes through their work. They are encouraged to see their enterprise activity as an offering to God. They are encouraged to see that they can contribute to God's kingdom. They are able now to give, not just to be constant recipients. They have gifts now to share because God has blessed them and has endowed them and has touched their lives with gifts to be able to serve their fellow neighbors. The presence of the Spirit in their work enables them to discern and experience God's blessing. It is this blessing. It's not the blessing of having a wonderful house and having plenty. It's the blessing of being able not only to take care of your family, but to also to serve God, to give to others. That is real blessing in their experience. To follow the patterns that are right in God's sight and to be God's judgment as well as his promise. As the poor face many challenges of economic enterprise with very limited resources, the sense of God's presence, of God's Spirit, gifting, empowering, protecting, and leading is a rich daily resource. Prayer becomes a big resource to connect with God's Spirit. Now, it is here that I want to digress a little bit to say that the idea of gifts, the idea of equipping people is critically important. One of the problems in the world today, as there is so much money available now, increasingly more and more people believe they've got to invest in providing financial capital to poor people. Fine. That's very important. Microfinance funds are growing, leaps and bounds, lots of money available. But one of the missing pieces, which the church has always been able to contribute to, is who actually equips and skills these people with the abilities and the skills in order to be able to use that capital. No one invests in skill development. Hardly anyone is willing to invest in skill development. Even in terms of producing loan funds for skill development. There are loan funds for education for the wealthy, but loan funds for skill development. We need more of those. So that have loan funds, pay for it, develop your skills, then go to microfinance, start doing businesses, or get together and do businesses and address your poverty. Now that's really critically important. But the church and Christians who have always had a focus on education and skill development need to do much more of that. In this rush to provide millions of loans, lots of loans to a lot of poor people, we tend to forget money is not the only resource they need. They need skills as well. And this is a critically important one. And the idea, and they have gifts, and God empowers you. And this is one way in which we draw out their gifts and grant them and enable them with skills. This is the spiritual capital of the poor, their faith and their experience of the Spirit through prayer and worship. Spiritual capital is not the only capital of their faith, but not the belief system, but the capital of their experiences, the presence and actions of God in their lives. The poor have this spiritual capital and know how to deploy it. When combined with access to financial capital and drawing on their social networks, which is their social capital, and, as it were, shaped and made whole by the spiritual capital of the poor, which they possess, the poor are well equipped to take on the risks and challenges of economic enterprise and activity. They face many more risks than many wealthier businessmen do. And they're able to cope with that because this whole capital, this capital which they have, is able to lead them on. Christian witness to God's kingdom is to proclaim the good news to all and particularly the poor. Christians today own a high proportion of wealth. It is true that many poor in the world are also Christian. Inviting the poor to enter and experience God's kingdom requires wealthy Christians to demonstrate their personhood as God's children in the stewardly use of their own wealth with wisdom and skills. It is in their stewardly relationship with the poor they will enrich their own personhood and flourish as God's children. Without that, they will be the poorer as persons despite their material riches. The relationship of the kingdom of God that most needs to grow today is the relationship of being joint heirs, joint regent, joint stewards, not merely stewards of our own resources, with the poor stewards, with those neighbors stewards, with those neighbors joint regents of creation between the wealthy and the poor. Can we create a culture of neighborliness? Not a neighborliness of gated communities. Can the church and Christians create a culture of real neighborliness, which is truly global, which is neighborliness of the rich with the poor, of those who are creating wealth and those who are struggling in poverty? Is that possible? Only the understanding of really recognizing them as those made in God's image, with all the potential of being enriched and flourishing in the image God gives them, and recognizing them as their neighbor to whom we have really a mutual relationship and even an obligation, and creating that can enable that to happen. And this, I believe, need not be limited to Christians only. This understanding of neighborliness. See, I've long said, and I've said this in India, the understanding of neighbor is unique to the Christian faith. I know there is an understanding of neighbor in Islam, but I've done some study, and I was talking to Lamin Sane last night. It is not the same as the neighbor that Jesus described in the New Testament. This is our particular gift to bring, not just and this neighborliness, a culture of neighborliness, which is really the transforming of our cultures. Not a culture of mere consumption and selfishness for myself. Not even a culture of giving. Yeah, okay, give. But that giving has to come out of this culture of neighborliness. Because we are called to love God and to love our neighbor. And through that culture of neighborliness, we discover and experience a richness of our relationship with God that we will never get otherwise. Our overflowing churches in many parts of the world are in the midst of much wealth and much grinding poverty. That is not an integral vision of God's kingdom. We need to expend as much energy and as many resources to develop God's partnerships, to develop partnerships addressing and neighborliness addressing poverty. Such partnerships may also be with other faith communities and those not motivated by religion but sharing a vision to be stewards and to be neighbors. We have the resources. Let me share. We have the tested mechanisms for action. We need the commitment. And that's my call as I end. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinay, for this tour of important resources from the Christian tradition to addressing the world poverty, the abject poverty in the world. And thank you for sharing something out of your own experiences and how these resources intersect with your own rolled up sleeves, as I have said in the introduction. I think we do have a few minutes for comments and questions, and so I would like to, if you are not adverse to this idea, to invite the members of the audience to comment or ask questions. There are 2 microphones on each side of this auditorium, so please feel free, and I think I will simply allow Vinay to moderate his own questions.
Well, first of all, thank you for that inspiring address. As a fellow Anglican, I'm even prouder now of being one. I was interested in your concluding comments about the fact that the poor have spiritual capital and they know how to use it. And an earlier comment that they need skill development. My question goes to how do you align the one with the other, and how does one build on the other? Does that make sense?
I mean, just unpack that for me a little bit, yes.
Excuse me?
Describe that a little more, what you're saying. I'm just not able to get the question.
In your comment that the poor have spiritual capital,
yes,
and they know how to use it, that's a resource. And yet your comment was that they need skill development, and they need to get some assessment of and pride in their gifts. Now, if they have spiritual capital, my assumption is that that's part of their gift.
Yes.
And how do you translate that powerful spiritual capital into identifiable and useful skills?
Yeah, I mean that's where my own work. You're absolutely right. As I said, I use the word trust, the importance of developing trust as a basic value in ability to cope with risk, trust, and really discipline All these are critically important values in any successful economic activity. And instead of seeing them as kind of mere material activities, to link them with the spiritual capital they already have has been the success that we have seen. And to say, your spiritual capital, your understanding of God. Let me give you a very simple illustration, which I actually forgot because I have it in my listing. We worked with a village. This was about 8-9 years ago when Bangalore was changing. And rapidly, you see what happens. This village, people wanted this land naturally because the value of land is so high as the city expands. So they want to get rid of these villages. And so suddenly these people whose livelihood was, small banana plantations, this is a completely Muslim village, they lost all their livelihood. The women came to me, about 26 of them in their, hijab, the burqa as we call that, a black hijab. And because I speak the Urdu language, which they wanted to speak to me in, and they said to me, help us. The only option we have is to become prostitutes, to care for our children. The children are starving. We don't want to do that. And these were really very, very attractive women, younger women. And can you give us something? So we started this micro-enterprise project. And for me, this is very interesting. For someone who comes from an evangelical background, my concern was not, to convert them or anything of that sort. My concern was to draw on their spiritual resources, on their own spiritual capital. So we said, could we pray? You pray. The most important thing is you get together in small groups, but definitely spend time praying to God. Just calm, meditate and pray. That was important. They said, no, pray. Start linking your spiritual life with your economic reality, all that. And they started coming together. Kind of long story short, we taught them, gave them the skills of doing these fish tanks, small fish tanks. And they started earning. And they were able to do the fish tanks because they had a piece of land, so we were able to get fish, and we taught them how to do freshwater fish, and they were able to sell, earn. But also the poignancy of the whole thing. 3 years later, they were earning so well, and the men had not done very well. The men refused to allow them to have anything to do with us. I reacted badly, I must confess. I've asked the Lord to forgive me for doing that. I called the men in. I said, I'm going to send you all to Pakistan. I refuse to have you do this. I shouted at them. I said, how dare you do this? Which was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And you can't do that to Muslim men anyway, That is just impossibly the wrong thing to do. Because I knew the language, I could speak like that, but it was the wrong thing to do. But it's very, very tough, very tough. The men were really disempowered and were finding it very difficult. So we are looking at other ways in which we can help the men find, skills. Because they're no longer skilled. They had certain skills which are no longer marketable, cannot produce the income. The world has changed. So we need to keep on. You see, those people, we must be engaging in helping and developing their skills also. And reinforcing it with their own spiritual capital. So they're able to face the risks and so on and so forth. Now that's what I was talking about.
My name is Neil Arner. I'm a student here at the Divinity School. Your own life story reminds me of one of my own heroes who took an opposite path and came from England to India to work, the late Leslie Newbegin. In Newbegin's own ministry, he considered the concept of mission to be vitally important in inspiring Christians to become involved in many of the themes that you have raised as well. I wondered if you might comment on how mission, a theme that you didn't mention, but I suppose is implicit in much of what you said, could be helpful perhaps in encouraging Christians to undertake the tasks that you've outlined.
Yes, I did not use the word mission simply because I think all that I'm talking about is Christian. And I did say one sentence was, God's calling to transformational action, which is mission for me. And yes, I think an earlier presentation that I did is to talk about mission as transforming our cultures today. It is really fundamentally seeing that the Christian understanding is not merely just activities that address some poor needs of people, poor, but it's much deeper than that. The Christian resources have to deal with really the way in which cultures themselves change and people themselves change their culture. And that's why we talk about changing it from a culture of sort of consumption and merely supporting and helping the poor to a culture of neighborliness. To me, that is to create a culture of neighborliness in our world today is a significant call to mission for Christians. So, yeah, that's absolutely.
Hello, I'm Larry Stratton. I'm a PhD student at Princeton Seminary. And my question has to do with something that you didn't talk about, but I'm just curious based on what you said about basically private initiatives of churches and I guess foundations and things like that with microfinance. What would you recommend if you were speaking before government officials about what changes in policies might be done to affect the good that you're promoting?
I think the governments are actually very, very aware of it. In India, some of the things that we have done in India was not only because there was no policy, government policy, to allow microfinance banks, and because no regulations for financial services to the poor. They were all meant for the wealthy and for the other world. And therefore, we invested quite a bit of money in actually doing the kind of research that needs to be done. So there was evidence-based research that really shaped our policy document, and we suggested to the policy, and Colin was very clever in getting our central bank, our Reserve Bank of India, as it's called, our central imperial, our central bank, an official from there, to come and learn what microfinance is by working with us in Bridge Foundation for 2 years. 2 years. So he, for the first time, the people who actually created the financial regulations worked with us for 2 years, you see. And then he went back and was able to shape the law so that the Parliament passed all the right laws in order to grow financial banking and all that sort of a thing, you see. But of course, the bankers never get satisfied. They want, I'm sorry to say it, but, they want more and more, they're making so much of money, but they still want more concessions just because they're doing a little bit of microfinance and all that sort of thing. But it is changing. So you need to do that more and more. But you need to do that by actually showing it works. Not as a government thing, but the kind of regulations and conditions that they create in order that financial flows are there. There are proper incentives for investment and incentives for scaling up and growth, all that sort of thing, yes, increasingly being done. And protection, of course, of property, protection of the poor. We are now looking at a variety of other things that, again, Colin will talk about tomorrow, on how to ensure proper credit scoring for the poor. Because how do you help a variety of areas where they begin to engage in the market as those who understand what the market... See, not to say, throw the market out, change it completely so that the poor can be comfortable as they are. No, you can't. You've got to enable the market to create spaces in the market through regulations and everywhere so that, and also equip the poor in order to actually engage and deal with the market on the market terms, but with adequate protection and support by government policies. That's what is happening increasingly.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Phil Parshall at the Overseas Ministry Studies Center and a visiting fellow here at Yale Divinity School this semester. My wife and I have been missionaries in Bangladesh for 20 years, and we have been in the Philippines for the last 22 years as missionaries. We've been surrounded by poverty for 42 years, and we have listened to all the pontifications of the elite and the political leaders, and they all give verbal assent to needs and say that they're going to do this and that. But on the ground level, because this is where we have lived for these 42 years, we see almost no lasting, effective impact. It just seems like, I come away very pessimistic about this whole subject. It seems like the banquet table just gets more lavish, more food piled on, and the crumbs keep getting less and less and less. And to bring it down to another level where you all are, because you live here in New Haven, we were here 13 years ago in exactly the same capacity we are now, and we listened to the gunshots and the sirens and everything that goes on the other side of Prospect. We come back 13 years later, still hearing all the pontifications and all the concern for the poor and all the resources of Yale and everything else, and we're still hearing the gunshots and we're still hearing the sirens. And I guess my heart is quite broken because I've spent these 42 years among the poor, disenfranchised, And I just wonder, will the rich, the powerful ever hear their voice?
I mean, I think for me, Phil, thank you very much. I think when you actually live day after day, when you speak like that, quite frankly, I hear my wife talking because she would say exactly the same thing. She would say, will the rich hear? Because she lives. For even a child, she does work with street children quite a bit. Every child, she would love to see every street child. There are 570 children under the age of 12 who come into the Bangalore city every day and get lost as street children. They get taken up into all sorts of trades. Every day. They come to the railway station, they come to the bus station, and we go there and pick up and try to do. She would like to take care of all of them. We have no resources. It's just not impossible to do that. I can despair as well. I can despair. But you see, I have seen there are many wealthy in Bangalore who are now beginning to see and hear the voice of the poor. And I see that increasingly so even here, whether it is the founders of Google or eBay or anybody else. They are saying, okay, we've done it, but now, we are beginning to hear, we are seeing. It's to connect the two is the critically important one, because there are two very different worlds. And to understand it is extremely difficult. People ask me, Vinay, produce an investment plan, a business plan for me so we can really invest, venture capitalists. And I write up something as well as possible, but they cannot understand what I write because I'm writing from a development perspective. And they say, we'll never give money to this because they can only give money to certain, which really helps them to understand an activity in the terms they have seen activities flourish and grow and be secure. And it is to bring those, and that's why this conference is important. This is to bring that connection is critically important, not to give up hope. My wife despairs 3 times a day, you see. And every night, I ring her every day, and every night before she goes to bed, we pray together. Okay, wherever we are, we pray together. And she tells me all the stories, and it's always weeping. Agreed, yes. There are people who have to weep. Others get angry, If the others really get angry and rage. But I think the church's responsibility is, and that's why I use the word generosity, very much, as the heart of it. Because working with the poor, it's not class anger. It's not class even despair. There is despair of their own situation. It is constantly saying hope, the hope that drives them. Another theme that I wanted to bring up, but I didn't bring up adequately. I did mention it. The whole understanding of hope, deeply, deeply ingrained. Yeah, it's there. And I think I begin to see much more. Microfinance, just to say very quickly, microfinance is not the answer to poverty in many ways because, for example, what microfinance has done, we've done some research in Madras University and elsewhere to show what microfinance does is really produces income security. I've done some work to show in the past, before microfinance, a poor person, a laborer, sort of semi-skilled or unskilled laborer, would get work for 157 days a year. The rest of the year, daily wages for 157 days a year. The rest of the year, he was poor, borrowed, and got into debt and became poorer and poorer and poorer. Now, what has happened for microfinance is it has given the poor the capacity to have almost 320 or 330 days of daily wage and income because they're earning it. So at least income security has taken place. It's not economic, growth in their own lives. There is income security. They're able to have some income security. And that's a very good foundation on which to build now these skills so that they can enter into the markets of the world and are able to now grow and earn and improve that. And this is where the skills of business people, the regulations of the government, the policy of the government, all must be pulled together in order in partnership to be able to do that. And we are beginning to see that. I'm beginning to see. I'm much more hopeful, let me say. Of course, I'm an eternal optimist anyway, but it is this that I see. But I do see real evidence.
Good evening, Dr. Samuel. I'm a student here. My name is Rakesh. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for that. As I would describe it, a very truthful portrayal of empowerment of the poor people. For the last 4.5 years, I worked with the Christian Conference of Asia based in Hong Kong. And part of my job was youth empowerment, which involves a lot of poverty alleviation issues and skill training. And I'd like to give just 3 brief examples by way of making 2 points, and I'd like to hear your views on that. I worked in Pathalgaon, which is on the border of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. And I spent nearly 3 months there. There's no electricity, no water, but it was very fruitful time. And we were trying to get some farmers organized so that they could take the tomatoes they grew, not through a middle person, but directly to the market. Mm-hmm. Because the middle person would sort of, cut the rates down, the prices down. And we learned that it was not enough. Because this sort of one time going and doing something and then getting out, even if it's after a year, it's really not helpful. And that's sort of one of the points I'm leading towards, which is the sustainability of any project, be it micro or macro finance. Something like that also happened in Thailand, where I worked in Chiang Mai, and there was it was a village actually, and all these youngsters who didn't have jobs or were not educated, they were naturally tending towards antisocial activities, which include drugs a lot, which is quite sort of common in Thailand. And so after speaking with the local church leaders there, they came up with this great idea. They said buy footballs, soccer balls. It didn't connect. But then it made sense because giving them soccer balls allowed them to play every evening. And that would sort of bring them together, and that's where the youth would be involved instead of thinking of doing a bunch of other things. But again, the question came back, how long does this continue? How many matches? How many years do they play? A similar situation I faced in Myanmar, near Rangoon when I traveled. And all that has sort of taught me a few things. And I think one of the things is the need to somehow develop into any mechanism we have for empowerment, a sense of long-term sustainability. One way to do that we found was to not give loans, but to give gifts. And that's why I liked your theology of gift giving. It's very important because a sense of ownership is involved in giving a loan, that I'm giving this to you, but I expect it back. And that can sometimes create issues when the financing is done through certain institutions. As you rightly said, whose motivation may at the end of the day still be to generate more wealth. But this still has to have some sort of accountability. And so the idea was to give gifts, which would then have the people who are receiving those gifts create more gifts for others, and so we sort of pass it down the chain in a village or in a town. And so those 2 points, the sense of how do you have this long-term sustainability and focusing more on gifts than loans, because I think debt cancellation is a big issue that many of us feel concerned about, and how that works, and how that is sort of perpetuating the system which we are trying to work with in terms of the financial systems. I don't know if there are questions, but I thought I'd just like to hear your comments on them.
Thank you. I think just to very quickly, briefly say that the whole idea of sustainability is critically important, and it's very difficult. Sustainability has to really do with changing the culture, changing the cultural, changing the situations, changing culture. That's where sustainability really has to do with it, and that's why I talked about changing the culture thing. And I believe we are actually. It's not a question of gifts. I'm saying we need to draw on the generosity of the people, so that and the idea of a mutuality and covenant, so that enables them to take the responsibility for the investment we make and the capital that is available to them and use it properly, grow with it, pay back. That's why we have. In many of our works, we have about 98% return of loans, on-time return of loans. In my own works, which is very small, but in compared to the Bridge Foundation, my wife's work, and I must say that, my wife practices and I preach what she practices. So it's entirely, my theology comes out of her practice. But it's just, it's really 100%. Why? Because it is not a mere loan, it's not a mere loan. It's much more than that. It's a sharing. Oh yes, it is financially very rigid. You sign all the forms. There is all that security. You are making a commitment, but in a context of mutuality and generosity. And I think that is the difference of real economic success.
Maybe one more question.
Okay. Vinay, thank you. Jonathan Bonk from the Overseas Ministry Study Center. You alluded to the sabbatical and Jubilee laws, and they seem in some sense, given what the prophets say, to have anticipated the human predisposition to disequilibrium and a permanent disequilibrium once one has gained an advantage, to keep that advantage and to pursue it. And in the prophets, that's translated into talk of justice. So I'm interested, because a lot of what you're saying seems to assume that there is an environment in which there are given rules that are enforced by neutral referees, when in fact in the scriptures that you quote, a lot of poverty is tied directly to powerful people who want to maintain advantage and who won't release or relinquish any of that disadvantage at any price. So where does justice and where does the struggle for justice come into your paradigm, please?
Yeah, the struggle for justice comes to the paradigm where the church basically says, that's why I said the covenantal sense of, I would, rather than demand justice, I would create the, challenge the, I'm coming at the struggle for justice through the understanding of covenant as mutuality that we witness to, and that we live in this world and there is mutuality to that. And I'm coming to it also from the concept of neighborliness. There is, the poor neighbor has a charge on my life, rather than saying that I need to be given justice, the demand for justice. So while I agree I'm not too much into the rights-based approach. There are these rights and the obligation for justice. I think it's the understanding, the obligation of neighborliness in which justice flows out. Justice must flow out rather than justice squeezed out and demanded, because that's not a real basis for lasting relationships. In that sense, maybe it's a weaker understanding of justice. But it's probably, in a world like ours, it may be in the long run eventually more productive. So I guess what I'm thinking, I come from a sort of business orientation in my life. So I look for what is possible. Just this kind of a call for justice may be a very good exercise for the one who is screaming and shouting and doing that. But what is the end result? Who gets empowered? Where does the actual justice, the result of that justice take place? And I find very little in all these things. That's my real struggle.
Hard to imagine the abolition of slavery if you're not. Where is there must be some kind of issue.
Well, I think we obviously we are going to do this 200-year celebration of Wilberforce. I'm engaged with some of those things in that. I think you will see that there was always that. I don't think if they didn't get all those business people on board to realize the economic disadvantages of slavery, I don't think it would have happened. I don't think it was just simply the call. It was simply, economically, it was not becoming viable. And people were being told that. And also spiritually, it was a big spiritual danger. There were a whole lot of things that made sense to the powerful business people who perpetuated, allegedly, slavery. And they did. But they realized, it was a reasonable argument to them. No blood was shed. And no one was shot. None of those slave owners were shot. It did get... that's what I'm talking about. I think there is, a reasoned approach. I guess I'm too shaped by British reasoning to be a Marxist. Do you understand what I mean? Yeah.
It looks like we have one more question. Let's make it short, and then we will conclude.
I'm just a lawyer. I have no faith-based qualifications whatsoever, but I've been around for a little bit. It just seems to me when we talk about we're going to get rid of poverty, we live in a dream world. We're going to eradicate poverty? Well, not in our lifetime and not in a long time. And it always seems to me when people begin to talk about social justice, we have committees for social justice in my church. What does that all mean? Doesn't mean a thing. You hit it right on the head. They are puffing their chest, I'm for social justice and all of those good things. I think the basic thing that has to be done in the whole world is the promotion of capitalism. Capitalism is the answer to all of the problems in society. It makes an economy go forward. It brings up the poor. It makes life better for everyone. Look at Singapore. Look at all these other places. And I see that today there's a professor here at Yale wrote a book denigrating capitalism, and not once beginning to see that in the last 20 years we have more people going to college, that the death rate for children is down, and other things that I don't have to mention. But that's capitalism. And we always sort of talk, I believe, around the problem where this is the answer. Micro credits and so forth have to be part of the growth of a capitalistic system. And I believe that that's the whole problem that we have, this ability not to realize that capitalism is the answer. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to enter into your interfamily debates, obviously, but I think what I've laid out was not so much capitalism, I trust, because it's not the isms that I was talking about. I was laying out what are the Christian themes that promote a way in which we do it. And in a sense, a kind of an economy that focuses on capital, all types of capital, that focus on mutuality, that focus on freedoms, which, capitalism can also misuse that. There are types of capitalism which are also ugly, and it's not perfect. But on the other hand, these themes, which I think are far more compatible with the kind of systems of open markets, enabling and equipping people to make use of that, than, I would say, systems which demand kind of political solutions, which at the end of the day don't really deliver. That's my practical conclusion. Okay, thank you.